Thank you to all three speakers. And I believe we have around 20 minutes for questions. And as always, a facilitator has an opening question, so I will start us rolling. This is a question for Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham to get us started. You've heard some fantastic presentations from the three panellists today. And I guess something that resounds with me is why is it necessary to actually have any reform in higher education after all? The sector seem to be telling us that they're doing very well, and in particular in South Australia incredibly well when you hear those figures around infrastructure investment and the fact that the universities have funded that themselves. So can't the sector carry on as usual? There's a we'll be fine sort of tone to this. So if that's the case, why is the government bringing a set of reforms back to Parliament?
Sure, thanks Christine, and a few reasons. Obviously, I stressed in my opening remarks some of the budgetary reasons, how it is that we go about addressing the federal budget challenge and recognising that one of the things that has contributed to the vast growth in spending over the last few years has been a significant growth of investment and funds flowing into universities, and that's happened because, of course, the numbers of students have gone up so dramatically. And we think that, yes, universities have been well managed in that time. It's good that they've generated surpluses. Of course, we want them to generate surpluses. The difference is when John Dawkins introduced HECS and at the time expanded access, far more modest level of expansion than we've seen recently, but an expansion of access that was funded through the introduction of HECS. HECS was introduced to help pay for that, so that taxpayers could see a pathway in which it was funded. The expansion we've had recently has hit the budget bottom line. Now, David said in relation to the areas of infrastructure investment the universities have been undertaking, that in the case of UniSA, it hasn't been funded by debt. Well, it hasn't been funded by debt at the UniSA level, but of course the funds flowing into the three institutions have been funded by debt that every taxpayer carries, the debt of the Commonwealth Government. That's a significant level of debt, and it's a debt that we've been struggling to bring under control. So on the financial side, there's an argument as to why we're tackling it, and recognising, as I said, that there's been a 71% growth in teaching and learning funding flowing into the institution since 2009, twice the rate of economic growth across Australia, significantly above any revenue growth that the government's seen, or indeed that most other areas of public policy and public funding have seen in that period of time. So there's that aspect of it. But then there's a broader picture of, well, what are the types of incentives that have been created? And by creating a demand-driven system purely in the undergraduate space, we've of course created a narrow window of opportunity for universities to expand the offering they have. And they've responded by, of course, growing numbers of enrolments in that one's category of qualification, because they're still restricted in terms of the space or the student enrolments they can grow elsewhere. That's the type of distortion, I guess, in terms of the enrolment decisions that are available to universities. So we're trying to make changes there that create a more consistent profile across all of the different uni qualifications that enable them and students to have a freer range of choosing the type of qualification that best suits their needs, coupled with the type of performance arrangements that we hope can see outcomes achieved in relation to admissions practices, attrition rates, completion rates, employment rates for graduates as a real focus that are not touched upon by the type of regulatory settings that Colin mentioned. TEXA, as the university regulator, has a job to make sure that quality teaching and learning occurs, but it doesn't function as an incentive to make sure that the enrolment decisions and the focus on how students are trained and where they end up going and the pathways they go into are geared directly towards the type of outcomes that I'm sure the three gentlemen here with me all want and that everybody else wants, but actually creating an incentive to, and a financial incentive to ensure universities are optimising the direction of graduate pathways and ultimately their applicability to the job prospects of those graduates or to their success. So, Christine, it's a broad question. with a range of different reasons as to why it is we think that this is important, and they do sit alongside one another, dealing with financial and budgetary questions, as well as dealing with questions of responsiveness and accountability in terms of meeting economic opportunity. I think we're able to look at these types of changes at present, in part because our universities are doing so well, because they are being so successful, but that doesn't mean that they should be isolated as an area of significant taxpayer investment that isn't asked when they're seeing such success to make some contribution back towards issues like budget repair, as well as looking at how it is we can make sure that they're as responsive to our future economic needs and the needs of students as possible in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate you answering that question. I believe Professor Sterling wants to respond once, and then I'm going to take that question down the back. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Christine. I would just say that, yes, the cost to higher education has increased substantially, and clearly it's an issue for government, it's an issue for our economy. Of course, the reason it's increased is not because we're making greater margins, it's because we're educating more students. So we have more of our young people and some returning students who have a greater opportunity to be successful in the economy into the future. In terms of choice, the subjects that students choose to study, it's more a choice of students in most instances than it is of institutions. The students choose the subjects that they're interested in, not us. But when it comes to things like employability, these are very complex matters. And if one were to function only on the basis of subsequent employability, you look at things like nursing. Universities might move away from nursing because the state government isn't hiring nurses at the minute. But this country faces a crisis in nursing in the next 5-6 years or so, as many existing current nurses are nearing retirement. We need to have the workforce in place. We can't be held responsible for the slight variations that will occur year to date. And if we are, we should be held responsible by the students themselves. If graduates of a given university in a given program don't get jobs, students won't come to that institution, won't study that subject, they'll study something else. There's a self-regulation in the market available through the student choice itself that really is more than adequate.
Thank you, Colin. Gentleman down the back to my right, thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Brendan Hughes. I'm the Director of Student Engagement at the University of South Australia, Australia's University of Enterprise. And just wanted to thank you for all your remarks. I think this question is posed to Senator Birmingham, and it's actually a great segue from Professor Sterling's comment just about employability for our students and our graduates. It's about internships, and I think that I don't want to go into the debate about budgets. I'll let you folks talk about that at your level. But I'm just wondering it from the Commonwealth's perspective, and you mentioned a number of the agencies like Defence and Health and Education who would be contributing to research. I think that one of the challenges I see in my role is trying to help ensure that our students have internships and placements across these sectors, and obviously the Commonwealth Government is a very large component in that, and I'm wondering if there's any thoughts you might have on the willingness for the Commonwealth to, develop some of these, to me, I don't think are very expensive, but opportunities to collaborate so that we can ensure that our students are getting work-integrated learning opportunities.
Sure, thanks. And look, great question. And in terms of getting Commonwealth government departments, agencies, etc., to help with those creation of those opportunities, I'm very eager to facilitate universities in having those discussions and to encourage my fellow ministers to open those doors wherever possible. It is, as I alluded to, it's one of the reasons why we decided in this budget to allow for the first time work experience units as part of a degree pathway to also receive funding, so that again the right incentive is there. The incentive for universities to not think, well, if we're sending our students off to work experience as part of the degree, that means we're actually not going to be funded for them for that unit of their studies, which they want to create the incentive for universities to think, how do we do that to a greater extent? And I know there are some outstanding partnerships across the different unis represented here, and there are right around the country. But how do we encourage more of that opportunity? And yes, that of course is a two-way street. That we're creating now an incentive, or at least removing a disincentive for universities to encourage that as part of their course. How do we then, of course, make sure that there are sufficient businesses and employers, of which government is one significant part, that provide those opportunities for those placements to actually occur? And so, to the direct question of getting government to partner in that, very happy to take that on and see what we can do.
Thank you. I believe I have a question down the front here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Senator. Richard Matthews from University of Adelaide. On looking at the budget as you announced, it's encouraging that HEP is actually going to be legislated and protected in legislation, but it appears that there's a $7 million cut. It goes from 147 million to 140 million, and then there's an increase if we can trust forward budget estimates. But as we all know, every year the forward budget estimates do tend to change. So I'm just wondering, why do we actually see that $7 million cut in the first instance?
Richard, in that sense, we're taking HEP essentially to from being a capped budget allocation to a demand-driven type budget allocation, and that's why you'll get some year-to-year variances. At present, we have a fixed pot of money that is then carved up across the universities based on a share of students from identified backgrounds of disadvantage that each university may have. What we're proposing to shift it to is a loading, as I said in my comments, a sort of, if I wear my school funding hat, a Gonski school funding loading type measure where the university receives it on a per student basis, which means in shifting that across, you may not receive an exact, precise, identical allocation in one given year or the other, but obviously, essentially, we have kept the quantum broadly the same in terms of striking what the loading would be to start with, and then as universities respond, dependent upon their own individual enrolment decisions, they'll receive that extra funding. We're not proposing that it need be invested on the student. It is expected that unis, as they currently do, will be able to take that additional funding and apply it, whether it is to try to increase levels of ambition and potential participation in schools, as some do, right through, of course, to then far more targeted preparatory pathways like university college, or then direct interventions that may exist for certain equity students.
Thank you. I'm told we have time for one final question, and I have one down the front here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Andrew Abel from University of Adelaide. I've got a quick question directed at the three Vice Chancellors. I'm interested in this balance between cooperation and competition within the sector, and perhaps to the Minister, I think the changes that we're going through are encouraging competition. I'm not convinced that's the best approach. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could have a brief response from any of the panellists. Thank you.
In terms of, I'm not quite sure what you're aiming at here, but in terms of the balance of competition and collaboration between the three universities, we are naturally competing in many and varied ways, and that is healthy. But in the research space, for example, we're operating on the world stage, as you well know, Andrew, and we collaborate and combine in dozens and dozens of ways that probably don't get much publicity. So we're players within, collaborators within CRC, Centres of Excellence. We are engaged in all sorts of combined methods with defence. So there is a surprising level of cooperation between the three, and there needs to be if we're going to operate as a powerful force in order to compete nationally and internationally. So my answer would be there's a lot more collaboration than you imagine, but I think we could go much, much further.
I would just respond by saying that, again, yes, I think the university sector in Australia is immensely collaborative. And I think that's probably part of the reason why we are so successful broadly as a sector. Yes, we compete with one another in various domains, But otherwise, I think the cooperation is very, very positive. Within the IRU, for example, across 6 universities around the country, we have a collaborative program around educational standards that involves the sharing of best practice between those institutions in ways that I think is extremely positive. Now, would I be so keen to do that if there were 7.5% of my funding contingent on my achieving some benchmark in that level, and indeed achieving it to a better standard than my fellow universities do, because if I fall behind that benchmark, they get my money? I'm not sure that I'd tell them about the good things that I do quite so freely. So I think the 7.5% contingent funding could diminish the collective collegiality, actually, that exists even between the 3 of us here in South Australia.
I'd just add, SAMRI is a great example of what Mike was talking about. That's the only medical research institute in the country which is owned and operated by 3 institutions, 3 universities in partnership with a government department. At the undergraduate level, the competition provides choice to students. And then the programme viability is determined by the market. But then there's also where we recognise, the 3 of us, where we individually have to come together in areas like languages to make sure that we get language provision and cross-pollination of language credits across the organisations. So we try not to reinvent the wheel, even though we have an eye on as Colin alluded to, collegial competition locally.
And I think I'd simply add, and as you've heard, each of the institutions recognises that you need to have some of both. Now, you can argue about where you draw the line between collaboration and competition, but students won't get the best possible outcome without a degree of competition for who can attract the best and brightest student, who is standing out in one discipline versus another discipline of study. But in research fields, there's competition for breakthroughs, but there's also a pragmatic realisation that without collaboration, be it across areas of research infrastructure, like SAMRI, or be it across different disciplines and expertise that might be held in different universities, you won't get the type of breakthroughs and so on that are required. And I think in government policy settings, what we're seeking to do is enhance collaboration, not just between universities around research settings, but also between universities and other partner organisations in the research settings. But yes, when it comes to the teaching and training of students in the future, we want to make sure that the mechanisms in place are there to inspire the best from each university for their students, and that they are absolutely competitive to provide that best outcome for those students in that teaching part of their remit.
Thank you. Well, we're right on time, so I'd like to welcome to the stage Lisa Jarrett, who's a partner with Minter Ellison, who are joining us in sponsoring today's events, and Lisa will present to the panel a vote of thanks.